If deputies ever start tagging luxury yachts at sunrise, somebody made a very expensive mistake. The first thing I noticed that morning was how still the marina felt. Usually, by 6 o'clock, the docks were already alive. Engines hummed softly in the distance. Deck crews moved between slips carrying supplies. Seagulls circled above the water while sunlight reflected across millions of dollars worth of polished fiberglass and chrome. The smell of salt air mixed with fresh coffee drifting from the Marina Cafe near the harbor entrance. It was the kind of place people dreamed about owning. A place where successful business owners spent weekends watching the tide roll in from the comfort of luxury yachts. But that morning was different. The only sounds came from official vehicles slowly moving along the waterfront. Their flashing lights reflected off the calm water like scattered pieces of red and blue glass. Deputies walked methodically down the docks carrying clipboards and paperwork. One by one, notices were attached to several large yachts tied along the premium slips. Nearby owners stood frozen in disbelief. Some stared at the documents. Others immediately reached for their phones. Nobody seemed to understand what was happening. At least not yet. Then I saw Linda Barrett. She stepped out of a black luxury sport utility vehicle, wearing a white blazer that somehow looked even brighter beneath the golden sunrise. Her expression changed the moment she spotted the deputies. First confusion, then disbelief, then pure panic. She hurried toward the waterfront, her heels striking the concrete promenade with sharp echoes that carried across the marina. "What are they doing?" she demanded. Nobody answered immediately. A deputy calmly handed her a packet of documents. Linda barely looked at the first page before her face lost all color. Around her, yacht owners began gathering near the entrance to the main dock. The water remained perfectly calm, while tension spread through the marina faster than a storm warning. Some people whispered. Others pointed toward the impound notices now hanging from several vessels. Every few seconds, another deputy moved to a different slip and attached another document. Standing at the far end of the harbor beside a weathered wooden piling, I watched everything unfold. The morning breeze pushed small waves against the dock supports beneath my feet. The familiar smell of the marina surrounded me. Diesel fuel, salt water, fresh paint, ocean air. Normally those scents reminded me why I loved the place. Today they reminded me how quickly arrogance can sink. My name is Grant Walker, and that marina was worth approximately $6 million. Every dock, every utility connection, every harbor structure, every inch of waterfront infrastructure. It was mine, legally, documented, recorded, verified. The problem was that Linda Barrett and the Harbor Cove Homeowners Association spent years acting like it belonged to them. For a long time, most people believed them. They controlled access policies. They issued marina rules. They assigned slips. They spoke about the harbor as though they owned every board, every piling, and every foot of shoreline. The confidence was impressive. The paperwork was another story. Watching deputies move down the docks that morning, I thought back to the envelope that started everything. A single envelope. Thick white paper. Harbor Cove letterhead. Inside was a demand for $95,000. According to the HOA, I owed them a special marina access assessment. $95,000. To use my own marina. At first I genuinely thought it was a clerical error. Some accounting mistake. Some misunderstanding that could be corrected with a phone call. I had no idea that opening that envelope would trigger months of investigations, attorneys, county records, waterfront deeds, and courtroom hearings. I definitely had no idea it would eventually lead to deputies standing in my marina while luxury yachts were being tagged under court-authorized enforcement orders. But as Linda stared helplessly at the documents in her hands, 6 months earlier, the marina was the most peaceful place I owned. Every morning began with the sound of water gently tapping against dock pilings and the distant cries of seagulls circling above the harbor. The marina stretched across a protected section of coastline lined with premium slips, modern utility connections, and waterfront facilities that had taken years to develop properly. From the observation deck near the harbor entrance, I could see nearly every section of the property. Sunlight reflected across the water like liquid gold, while luxury yachts rested quietly in their assigned slips. Some owners arrived only on weekends. Others practically lived aboard their vessels throughout the year. It was a small community built around the water. Most people knew each other by name. Most conflicts involve things like maintenance schedules or fishing stories. Nothing dramatic. Nothing complicated. That was exactly how I preferred it. My name is Grant Walker, and I purchased the Marina several years earlier as part of a larger waterfront investment. The acquisition included docks, fuel facilities, utility infrastructure, maintenance buildings, parking areas, and long-term operating rights connected to the harbor itself. The transaction was substantial, but I believed in the property. The location was excellent. Demand for premium slips remained strong. More importantly, I genuinely enjoyed spending time there. Whenever business became stressful, I could walk the docks and remember why I bought the place in the first place. The smell of salt air had a way of clearing my mind. During those months, Harbor Cove Homeowners Association barely occupied my thoughts. The waterfront community sat adjacent to the marina, separated by landscaping, pedestrian walkways, and a series of access roads. Residents frequently used the harbor facilities. Many rented slips. Others owned yachts permanently moored there. The relationship seemed straightforward. The marina operated independently while serving people who happened to live nearby. At least that was how I understood the arrangement. Linda Barrett appeared occasionally at marina events. She attended ribbon cuttings, community gatherings, and seasonal celebrations held near the waterfront. She always carried herself with confidence. People listened when she spoke. Residents treated her like the unofficial mayor of Harbor Cove. At the time, none of that concerned me. Every community has influential personalities. Linda simply happened to be one of them. Looking back now, I realize I overlooked something important. During conversations about the harbor, Linda often referred to the marina as though it belonged to the HOA. Not directly, not explicitly, but the language was there. She talked about our marina. She discussed our docks. She referenced future improvements using phrases that suggested a level of authority I never questioned. Neither did anyone else. The assumptions had existed for so long that they sounded normal. On warm evenings, the waterfront became one of the most beautiful places on the coast. Restaurant patios filled with people enjoying dinner beside the harbor. Decorative lights illuminated the docks after sunset. Reflections danced across the water beneath rows of luxury yachts worth millions of dollars. Couples strolled along the promenade, while live music drifted from nearby venues. The marina represented success, stability, permanence. Everything appeared to function exactly as intended. That illusion lasted until a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. I had just finished reviewing routine maintenance reports when my assistant entered my office carrying a sealed envelope. The Harbor Cove HOA logo was printed across the front in dark blue lettering. At first, I assumed it involved some community event or administrative notice. Nothing unusual. I thanked her, set the envelope on my desk, and continued working for another hour before finally opening it. If I had known what was inside, I would have opened it immediately. Because tucked between several pages of official-looking paperwork sat a demand that would. I stared at the number for several seconds because my brain refused to process it. $95,000. The amount sat in bold lettering near the center of the page beneath the words Marina Access Assessment. I read the document again, then a third time. Nothing changed. According to Harbor Cove Homeowners Association, I was being assessed $95,000 to maintain access rights associated with the marina. The marina that I owned. The marina my company operated. The marina whose maintenance expenses, insurance costs, payroll obligations, and infrastructure improvements were already being paid through my business accounts. For a moment, I honestly wondered whether someone had accidentally mailed me paperwork intended for another recipient. The explanation seemed more reasonable than the alternative. The smell of salt air drifted through the open office window while yachts rocked gently outside the marina building. Everything beyond the glass looked calm and normal. The document in my hand felt like it belonged to a different reality. I called the number listed on the letter. After several transfers, I eventually reached an HOA administrator who politely informed me that the assessment had been approved by the Harbor Cove Board. When I explained that I owned the marina, an awkward silence followed. Then came a response I would hear repeatedly over the following months. Those decisions are handled by the board. That was it. No explanation. No clarification. Just a reference to the board. A few days later, I attended a Harbor Cove community meeting hoping the situation could be resolved through a simple conversation. The meeting took place inside an upscale waterfront clubhouse overlooking the harbor. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided panoramic views of the marina. Ironically, several of the slips visible from the meeting room belonged to the very property they were now charging me to access. Residents filled most of the seats while board members sat behind a long table near the front of the room. Linda Barrett occupied the center position. She looked perfectly comfortable, confident, prepared, as though she expected complete agreement from everyone present. When the discussion period opened, I introduced myself and asked a straightforward question. On what authority was the HOA charging the marina owner an access assessment for using his own marina? The room became noticeably quieter. Several residents turned toward me. Others exchanged confused looks. Linda smiled politely before answering. Her response sounded rehearsed. She explained that Harbor Cove maintained governance authority over waterfront access and marina operations through long-standing community arrangements. The wording was impressive. The details were not. I asked whether those arrangements were documented. Linda assured me they were. I asked where. She did not provide an answer. Instead, she spoke about community expectations, historical practices, and the role Harbor Cove played in maintaining waterfront standards. The entire explanation relied on tradition rather than documentation. As the meeting continued, I noticed something interesting. Every time ownership came up, the discussion shifted toward management. Every time authority came up, the discussion shifted toward custom. Nobody seemed interested in distinguishing between operating near the marina and actually owning the marina. Walking back toward the docks after the meeting, I found myself more puzzled than angry. The assessment itself was ridiculous, but the confidence behind it was even more surprising. Linda genuinely appeared to believe Harbor Cove possessed authority over property interests extending far beyond the HOA boundaries. The marina lights reflected across the water as evening settled over the harbor. Yachts swayed gently in their slips while restaurant patios filled with residents enjoying dinner beside the waterfront. Looking around, it was easy to understand why nobody questioned the arrangement. Harbor Cove had been acting as though it controlled the marina for so long that most people accepted the claim without thinking about it. I might have done the same if that envelope had never arrived. Instead, I drove home with a copy of the assessment sitting on the passenger seat beside me. The number still looked absurd. Yet by then, the amount no longer interested me nearly as much as the question hiding. The answer to that question should have been simple. If Harbor Cove possessed authority over the marina, there would be documentation proving it. A recorded agreement, a deed restriction, an easement, a management contract, something. Instead, every time I asked for evidence, I received explanations. Lots of explanations. Very little evidence. During the weeks that followed, the situation became increasingly strange. Additional letters arrived from the HOA. Some referenced deadlines. Others referenced penalties. All of them treated the $95,000 assessment as though it were completely normal. One notice even warned that failure to comply could result in restrictions related to marina access privileges. That particular phrase caught my attention immediately. Marina access privileges. The wording implied Harbor Cove believed it possessed authority to grant or deny access to waterfront infrastructure that my company owned and operated. The more I read, the more curious I became. One afternoon, I scheduled a meeting with Linda at the Harbor Cove Administrative Office overlooking the waterfront. The building itself reflected the community's image perfectly. Clean architecture, expensive landscaping, large windows facing the marina. From the conference room, several premium yacht slips were visible across the harbor. Ironically, those slips generated revenue that helped fund marina operations. Linda arrived carrying a folder and the same confidence she displayed during the community meeting. She greeted me politely before taking a seat across the table. For nearly an hour, we discussed the assessment. Or at least we discussed everything except the one thing that mattered. Whenever I asked where the HOA obtained authority over the marina, Linda redirected the conversation toward community standards. When I asked about ownership records, she referenced historical practices. When I asked about legal rights, she spoke about governance responsibilities. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every answer avoided documentation. Every explanation relied on assumptions that seemed to have accumulated over many years. At one point, Linda gestured toward the harbor outside the window. Harbor Cove has managed that marina for as long as anyone can remember, she said. The statement sounded persuasive until I considered what it actually meant. Managing something and owning something are not the same thing. A property manager does not own an apartment complex. A harbor master does not own the harbor. Oversight and ownership are completely different concepts. Yet throughout the meeting, those distinctions seemed to disappear whenever Harbor Cove discussed the marina. Afterward, I walked the docks alone. The afternoon sun reflected off the water while yacht owners prepared vessels for weekend trips. Crew members washed decks. Maintenance staff serviced utility pedestals. Everything looked normal. Yet the more I observed the harbor, the more unusual the situation appeared. Harbor Cove certainly influenced activity around the marina. They organized events. They communicated with residents. They established community expectations. But influence is not ownership. Influence is not legal authority. Several days later, another development caught my attention. A marina tenant forwarded an email distributed by the HOA. The message discussed future waterfront improvements and referenced the harbor in language suggesting direct control over marina operations. Reading it felt strangely familiar. Once again, Harbor Cove spoke as though ownership existed without ever specifically claiming ownership. It was a subtle distinction, but an important one. By then, my curiosity had evolved into concern. The issue was no longer the assessment itself. The issue was understanding why an entire organization appeared convinced it controlled property interests that might not belong to it. That realization led to a decision that ultimately changed everything. Instead of continuing debates with the HOA, I contacted an attorney specializing in waterfront property law. A week later, we met in an office overlooking the harbor. I brought every document Harbor Cove had sent: assessment notices, community communications, board correspondence. The attorney reviewed the paperwork quietly while making occasional notes. Finally, he placed the documents on the table and looked directly at me. "Grant," he said, "before we discuss the assessment, I want to see every deed, permit, operating." The investigation began with documents. Not rumors, not opinions, documents. Over the years, I had learned that property disputes almost always become simpler when enough paperwork reaches the table. People can argue about memories. They can argue about intentions. They can even argue about interpretations. Records are harder to argue with. A week after meeting the attorney, I arrived at his office carrying several storage boxes filled with marina files, purchase agreements, operating records, utility permits, harbor maintenance contracts, insurance documents, engineering reports, everything connected to the property. The office overlooked the waterfront, and through the windows I could see sunlight dancing across the marina basin while yachts rested quietly at their slips. It looked peaceful outside. Inside, an entirely different process was beginning. For hours, my attorney and his staff reviewed records page by page. The smell of coffee filled the conference room while stacks of documents slowly spread across the table. Every time someone located a relevant record, it was placed into a separate folder. Ownership, easements, access rights, waterfront permits, harbor infrastructure. The marina itself seemed to exist in hundreds of different documents created over decades. By the end of the first day, several things became clear. The marina had a very detailed ownership history. It had changed hands multiple times before I acquired it. Every transfer had been documented. Every major improvement had been documented. Every permit had been documented. What remained unclear was where Harbor Cove supposedly entered the picture. The next stage involved county records. My attorney requested copies of filings connected to the marina, the surrounding waterfront, and Harbor Cove itself. Several weeks passed while records were collected from various departments. During that time, the HOA continued sending notices. Additional deadlines appeared. Additional references to assessments appeared. One letter even suggested that unresolved obligations could affect future use of marina facilities. The confidence behind those notices never seemed to waver. If anything, Harbor Cove appeared increasingly certain that its position would hold up under scrutiny. That certainty became very interesting when the county records started arriving. One afternoon, I sat with my attorney as we reviewed a collection of waterfront plats spread across a large conference table. Detailed diagrams showed dock locations, shoreline boundaries, utility corridors, and marina infrastructure. Colored markers highlighted ownership interests. The attorney traced several lines with his finger before looking up. "This is where things start becoming unusual," he said. As more records were reviewed, a pattern emerged. Harbor Cove appeared repeatedly in documents connected to the residential community. Roads, common areas, landscaping, recreational facilities, community assets. Yet whenever the marina itself appeared, ownership references pointed somewhere else. The distinction was subtle at first. Then it became impossible to ignore. A few days later, we met with a specialist familiar with waterfront property filings. He reviewed the same records independently. Then he reviewed them again. His reaction reminded me of the surveyor in another business dispute years earlier. Professionals become very careful when evidence starts pointing toward conclusions that nobody expected. The specialist eventually leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "I am not seeing what they appear to think exists," he said. "I see management references. I see community references. I see operational interactions. But I am not seeing ownership authority over the marina." That statement changed everything. Until then, I had assumed there might be some overlooked agreement hidden somewhere in the records, some obscure document that explained Harbor Cove's confidence. Instead, every layer of investigation seemed to move in the opposite direction. The marina deed, the waterfront plats, the operating permits, the ownership history. None of them appeared to support the assessment. As the sun set over the harbor that evening, orange reflections stretched across the water between rows of luxury yachts. The marina looked exactly the same as it always had. Yet beneath that calm surface, a much larger discovery was taking shape. Because the breakthrough arrived on a cloudy Thursday afternoon when my attorney called and asked me to come to his office immediately. His tone was calm, but after months of working together, I had learned to recognize the difference between routine updates and significant developments. This was definitely the second category. By the time I arrived, several large maps were spread across the conference table beside stacks of county filings, marina permits, and ownership records. Through the office windows, the harbor looked gray beneath an overcast sky. Small waves rolled against the docks while yacht masts swayed gently in the distance. The marina appeared as peaceful as ever. Inside the conference room, however, the atmosphere felt completely different. My attorney pointed toward a collection of documents arranged in chronological order. Together, they traced the marina's ownership history back through multiple transactions spanning decades. Every transfer had been recorded. Every major change had been documented. Every infrastructure improvement had generated additional paperwork. Fuel systems, dock expansions, utility upgrades, shoreline permits. The deeper we went, the clearer the picture became. Harbor Cove appeared frequently in records related to neighboring residential property. Yet the marina itself remained attached to an entirely separate ownership chain. There was no recorded transfer, no assignment of ownership rights, no agreement granting Harbor Cove authority to impose marina assessments. The absence of those records became increasingly important because of what we discovered next. During the review process, my attorney located several internal references used by the HOA to justify its waterfront authority. At first glance, they sounded impressive. Community oversight provisions, waterfront management policies, harbor access standards. But once examined closely, the language described coordination, not ownership. Management, not control. Community expectations, not property rights. It was like watching a building slowly lose its foundation. The more documentation we reviewed, the less support Harbor Cove's position seemed to have. A week later, another specialist completed an independent review of the marina files. His conclusions matched the previous findings almost exactly. Then a third review reached the same result. By that point, a pattern had emerged that nobody could ignore. Harbor Cove had spent years behaving as though it possessed authority over the marina, but the records supporting that belief appeared remarkably thin. The discovery raised an obvious question. If Harbor Cove lacked authority over the marina, then on what basis had the $95,000 assessment been created in the first place? That question became the center of everything. My attorney requested additional documentation from the HOA. Responses arrived slowly. Some records were provided. Others were not. Explanations continued appearing where evidence should have been. Historical practice, community understanding, longstanding assumptions. The same themes repeated over and over. Yet assumptions do not become legal rights simply because they have existed for a long time. One afternoon, while reviewing another batch of documents, my attorney slid a file across the table toward me. Inside were records related to several large yachts occupying premium slips within the marina. The vessels belonged to individuals closely connected to Harbor Cove leadership. The details themselves were not unusual. What caught our attention was how certain marina privileges had apparently been treated as though HOA authority automatically existed. The records raised additional questions about fees, access rights, and operational decisions made over several years. Questions that now required answers. As summer moved closer, the investigation expanded beyond the original assessment dispute. County officials became interested in the ownership issues being raised. Additional records were requested. More reviews were scheduled. The marina remained busy with visitors enjoying the waterfront, completely unaware of what was happening behind the scenes. Every sunset still painted the harbor gold. Every morning still brought fresh boats through the channel. Yet beneath that normal routine, something significant was unfolding. Harbor Cove believed the matter would eventually fade away. Instead, every new document seemed to push the investigation in the opposite direction. And for the first time, my attorney began discussing a possibility neither of us. By late summer, Harbor Cove had a choice. The board could acknowledge the growing evidence, withdraw the assessment, and resolve the matter quietly. Instead, they doubled down. Another letter arrived at my office, thicker than the previous notices and carrying a noticeably more aggressive tone. The assessment remained. The deadlines remained. New warnings had been added. According to the latest correspondence, continued refusal to comply could trigger additional actions affecting marina operations and access privileges. I read the document while sitting in my office overlooking the harbor. Outside, the marina looked magnificent. Sunlight sparkled across the water. Charter crews prepared vessels for afternoon departures. Families walked the waterfront promenade, enjoying the warm weather. Nothing in the scene suggested a legal storm was gathering beneath the surface. Yet every new letter from Harbor Cove seemed determined to create one. My attorney was not surprised. In fact, he almost expected it. During our next meeting, he explained that organizations built on long-held assumptions often struggle when those assumptions are challenged. For years, Harbor Cove had operated as though its authority over the marina was unquestionable. Residents accepted it. Vendors accepted it. Even local businesses accepted it. Once a belief becomes part of everyday life, people stop asking where it came from. The problem for Harbor Cove was that the investigation kept asking exactly that question. Where did the authority come from? Where was the documentation? Where were the recorded rights supporting the assessment? Every request for evidence produced more explanations, but very little proof. Meanwhile, county reviewers continued examining ownership records and operational filings connected to the waterfront. One afternoon, my attorney received another collection of documents produced during the review process. Several of the records raised concerns about how marina-related privileges had been administered over the years. Certain arrangements appeared to assume authority that investigators were no longer convinced existed. That discovery attracted even more attention. The issue was no longer limited to a disputed assessment. It was becoming a broader examination of marina governance, waterfront authority, and property rights. Linda Barrett still projected confidence publicly. Community newsletters continued discussing marina matters as though nothing had changed. Harbor Cove meetings proceeded as usual. Yet subtle cracks were beginning to appear. Questions surfaced during board discussions. Residents started requesting clarification. A few yacht owners privately contacted my attorney seeking information about the investigation. They were not interested in choosing sides. They simply wanted to understand whether the authority they had accepted for years actually existed. The atmosphere around the marina gradually changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but people became more careful. Conversations lasted longer. Questions became more specific. Assumptions that once passed without challenge suddenly required answers. One evening, I stood at the end of the main dock watching the sunset paint the harbor orange and gold. Rows of luxury yachts reflected the fading light while gentle waves rolled beneath the slips. The marina remained beautiful despite everything happening behind the scenes. Looking across the water, I realized the dispute had never truly been about money. $95,000 had started the conflict, but the real issue was something much larger. Ownership, authority, accountability. Those principles mattered far more than any assessment notice. A few days later, my attorney called with another update. County reviewers had completed additional analysis, and formal proceedings were moving closer. Evidence packages were being organized. Ownership records had been verified. Waterfront filings had been cross-checked. The timeline for official review was becoming very real. For the first time since receiving that original envelope, I sensed the end approaching. Harbor Cove had spent months insisting its position was unquestionable. Now the documents would speak for themselves. And once those records reached the people, the official review took place on a clear autumn morning. By then, months of investigation had transformed a simple assessment dispute into something far more significant. My attorney arrived carrying several organized binders containing deeds, waterfront plats, marina permits, ownership records, county filings, correspondence, and independent analyses completed by multiple specialists. Every document had been reviewed repeatedly. Every timeline had been verified. Every claim had been matched against the actual records. For the first time since opening that original envelope, I felt completely confident about where the evidence would lead. The hearing room itself was surprisingly ordinary. There were no dramatic speeches, no emotional confrontations, no sudden revelations delivered for effect. Just facts, records, documentation, the kind of information that determines what is true regardless of who believes otherwise. Linda Barrett arrived with representatives from Harbor Cove and took a seat several rows away. She still carried the same confidence that had defined every interaction since the beginning of the dispute. Looking at her, I wondered whether she genuinely believed the evidence would support the HOA's position or whether she had simply invested too much in that belief to reconsider it. As proceedings began, ownership history became the central focus. One document after another established the marina's chain of title. Property transfers were reviewed. Waterfront boundaries were examined. Operational permits were discussed. Historical filings were entered into the record. Every piece fit together with remarkable consistency. The marina appeared exactly where the records said it should appear. The ownership trail remained intact. Most importantly, the authority claimed by Harbor Cove remained difficult to locate. Several times during the review process, questions returned to the same issue. Where was the documentation granting the HOA authority to impose marina assessments on the property's owner? Where was the recorded instrument supporting those claims? Where was the legal foundation behind the notices and demands that had triggered the dispute? The answers never seemed to arrive. Instead, references appeared once again to historical practices, community expectations, and long-standing assumptions. Yet each time those explanations surfaced, they were measured against actual documentation. And each time, the records carried greater weight. Hours passed as evidence was reviewed. Maps covered large portions of the presentation area. Detailed diagrams illustrated waterfront boundaries. Specialists explained how marina ownership, access rights, and operational authority were reflected throughout the records. Watching the process unfold felt strangely calm. For months, I had lived with uncertainty. Now the uncertainty was disappearing one document at a time. By late afternoon, the overall picture had become difficult to dispute. The marina's ownership was clear. The supporting records were clear. The lack of documentation supporting Harbor Cove's assessment authority was equally clear. My attorney remained professional throughout the proceedings, never raising his voice or attempting theatrics. He simply followed the evidence wherever it led. That approach proved remarkably effective. Facts do not need dramatic presentation when they already speak for themselves. Several weeks later, formal findings began taking shape. Additional reviews confirmed earlier conclusions. Administrative actions moved forward. Certain marina-related arrangements connected to the investigation received heightened scrutiny. The consequences extended beyond the original assessment because the underlying authority questions affected multiple decisions made over several years. Then came the development that brought everything full circle. Enforcement orders were authorized regarding specific matters identified during the review process. The paperwork moved through the appropriate channels. Notifications were prepared. Coordination with local authorities began. Early one evening, my attorney called with the update we had been waiting for. After months of investigations, reviews, hearings, and document analysis, the process had reached its final stage. The records had. The morning everything became official looked almost identical to countless other mornings at the marina. The water was calm. Seagulls drifted above the harbor. Sunlight reflected across rows of luxury yachts tied neatly along the docks. Yet beneath that familiar scene, years of assumptions were finally reaching their conclusion. I arrived shortly after sunrise and walked toward the main waterfront promenade. Several official vehicles were already parked near the harbor entrance. Deputies moved calmly through the marina, following procedures outlined in the enforcement orders that had been authorized weeks earlier. There was no chaos, no dramatic confrontation, just a methodical process built on months of investigation and years of documented records. One by one, notices were delivered. Certain vessels connected to matters identified during the review process became subject to official actions. Owners gathered in small groups along the docks, quietly discussing developments that many of them never believed would happen. The same marina that had served as the center of Harbor Cove's authority narrative was now serving as the place where that narrative finally met reality. Linda Barrett arrived shortly afterward. For the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely uncertain. Not angry, not defiant, simply uncertain. The confidence that had defined every meeting, every letter, and every conversation seemed to have disappeared. She stood near the waterfront watching deputies carry out their responsibilities while attorneys, officials, and marina personnel moved through the harbor. Nobody was interested in speeches anymore. The records had already spoken. The findings had already been made. The process was simply reaching its conclusion. Standing at the end of one of the main docks, I listened to the familiar sounds of water moving beneath the pilings. The marina looked exactly the same as it always had. The yachts remained beautiful. The harbor remained peaceful. The ocean breeze still carried the scent of salt air across the waterfront. Yet everything felt different because ownership, authority, and responsibility were finally aligned with documented reality. Later that afternoon, my attorney joined me near the observation deck overlooking the harbor. Together we watched boats move slowly through the channel while the marina continued operating normally. He smiled and handed me a copy of the final documentation package. Inside were the records that had driven the entire outcome. Deeds, waterfront plats, ownership histories, review findings, administrative determinations. Looking through the pages, I was struck by how ordinary most of them appeared. No single document seemed extraordinary on its own. Yet together they told a story that assumptions could never overcome. Harbor Cove had spent years relying on confidence. The records relied on facts. In the end, facts won. Over the following months, the marina settled into a new chapter. Operations continued. Slip holders continued enjoying the waterfront. Businesses along the harbor remained active. Visitors still gathered at restaurants overlooking the water. Life moved forward. The difference was that decisions affecting the marina now reflected actual ownership rights instead of inherited assumptions. Clarity replaced confusion. Documentation replaced speculation. Stability replaced conflict. Occasionally, people still asked about the dispute. Most expected a dramatic answer. They expected some clever strategy or courtroom surprise. The truth was much simpler. Everything changed because someone finally asked for proof. That was it. One question. One request for documentation. One investigation that followed the records wherever they led. As the sun set over the harbor that evening, golden lights stretched across the water and illuminated the marina I had owned all along. The yachts rocked gently in their slips while distant waves rolled beyond the breakwater. Watching the reflections dance across the surface, I thought back to that original envelope demanding $95,000. At the time, it seemed like the biggest issue in the world. Looking back now, it was merely the first loose thread. Once pulled, the entire story unraveled. And standing there beside the water, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a marina finally,